Hey, how you doing? I'm talking like this because I just did a podcast with an expert on the New York City Mafia, and this is how Italian guys from Jersey talk when we talk about the mob. Ooh! Anyway, it's all here in a fresh episode of the Savage Sack Tap, and it starts right now. So listen to it. What are you waiting for, you fucking jamoke?
You're listening to the Savage Sack Tap. It's not a podcast, it's not a half-cast, it's just a quick shot to the balls to help you finish off the week. We're cutting through the bullshit, filling your Friday with rage-fueled logic, and cracking a few jokes along the way. So grab a bag of frozen peas. There's a Savage Sack Tap coming your way.
Smooth, lascivious, salacious, outrageous.
Hey, what's up, guys? Mike Montone here. Welcome to a fresh episode of the Savage Sack Tap. And you know, as far back as I could remember, I always wanted to podcast about being a gangster.
I know I'd go from rags to riches.
All right. I'm sorry. Enough fuckery for one episode here. We're gonna get to the good shit in just a second. I do want to introduce Matty Cummings. Matt Cummings. He is the president of City Walks New York, City Walks NY. He is also a capo with New York City Gangster Tours, NYC Gangster Tours. You can find those at citywalksny.com and nycgangstertours.com, and we got all that information down in the show notes, and we'll plug it again at the end of the show. And I'm sure Matty plugged it a few times as we were going along. But great performer, really interesting guy with great knowledge of organized crime and the history of the New York City Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, as it is referred to. But please check it out. We had a great conversation. This is another in my series, podcast on a park bench, squeezing one in here before things start to get too cold to record outside. So I really hope you'll have as much fun listening to this as I had recording it, because I learned a shitload. I hope you'll learn a shitload, and I hope you'll enjoy it a shitload too, since we're talking about shitloads. But check it out. It was really an awesome chat, and I had a great time doing it. I'm hoping I can get him back on the show again. But with no further ado, Matty Cummings. Here you go, folks. We're rigged up and ready to chit chat.
So you're checking your levels. This is where I held it before, right? So
yeah, we should
be good.
We should be good on that. This rig does a pretty good job. So hopefully,
Nice.
Hopefully we don't fuck up. If so, it's just a nice conversation between new friends.
There you
go. So the New York City Gangster Tours.
New York City Gangster Tours, or NYC Gangster Tours is the
NYC
website.
Gangster Tours.
Yep.
Do you guys? Is it just Italian mob, or do you guys do everything?
Well, we got three products basically. Okay, so we've got I think the most popular one is the rise and fall of the American Mafia.
Okay.
And that's predominantly the Mafia, the Italian mobs, plus their Jewish counterparts.
Okay. You guys hit the Westies or anything like that over in Hell's Kitchen?
No, that we do not get into at all, actually. We don't have a product that we do that with. We did try doing an Irish Gangsters tour, a couple of years ago, and it just didn't take off.
Really?
And by the same token, another one of our products is the Jewish Gangsters of the Lower East Side. Now, we still have that on the website, but we just run that as a private tour.
That's for the Jewish. They're responsible for like the whole Murder Inc. where they're working with Lucha. Was it Lansky and
they were,
Luciano,
Maya Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and Louis Lepke Buckhalter. They were all part of. They were the boys from Brownsville, Brooklyn originally. They were not Lansky and Bugsy actually. Louis Lepke Buckhalter and Abe Rellis. They were the core members of Murder Incorporated. So they basically created the contract murder, just business, nothing personal.
What was the time frame for them?
20s, 30s.
Tied to Prohibition.
Yeah.
So Prohibition really gave the American Mafia like its first big boost.
Prohibition created the American Mafia. Before Prohibition, any kind of organized crime that had been happening already was really on the downside. It was really on the decline.
Yeah.
Prohibition was miracle grow to organized crime. Prohibition made the mafia what it became. Prohibition made gangsters what we're all familiar with in the old gangster movies. You know, snazzy and sharp and ruthless. And
Yeah, I
dangerous.
think people think of like the guys getting with a pinstripe suit topping out of the Model T with the Tommy
Yep.
gun and.
That all started with Prohibition. If it were not for Prohibition, we would never have had the mafia that we know.
So prior to that, what were we looking at? Kind of like just neighborhood bosses. I guess
Yeah, exactly.
Godfather 2 would probably be what most people remember.
Neighborhood bosses and small-time operators. They really didn't. Generally, most of them didn't see any. They didn't see any further than the street, than the neighborhood they were in. There was one guy who, before Prohibition, who really had his eyes on the prize, and he was not Italian, Arnold Rothstein.
Oh, was he involved in the 1919 World Series fix?
He was the one who was believed to have fixed the 1919 World Series, but he was never indicted on it, let alone.
As a lover of sports and a lover of organized crime, I was obsessed with that story when I was a little kid. I saw the movie, I read the book, I absolutely loved it. 8 Men Out, great story.
8 players on the Chicago White Sox, banned from baseball, from professional baseball for the rest of their lives.
And
none of the gamblers went down. That's the best part.
I have always felt horrible for Joe Jackson.
Yeah, shoeless Joe.
It always felt like he got manipulated, like he was, slow-witted, like farm boy. He's just good at playing baseball, doesn't know what he's getting himself into.
They kind of all did, though, really. They all got taken in the end.
And those guys were playing for like no wages. And it's not,
Well, the best part was Arnold Rothstein was definitely involved, and he was questioned by the Chicago DA. Arnold Rothstein was a genius. Okay, first of all, Arnold Rothstein taught Charlie Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky how to dress. He said, give up the flashy, suits, and dress like a businessman. Dress conservatively. Arnold Rothstein, he basically played 2 groups of gamblers off of one another to fix the 1919 World Series. And then what he did with one of them, he met one group in a restaurant here in Manhattan, and in the middle of eating lunch, he got up loudly from the table, knocked his chair over, threw his napkin on the table, and shouted, "I will not be a part of your World Series fixing scheme," and walked out of the restaurant.
to create the illusion that that a man like him would never be involved in.
And then when he told the Chicago DA, he said, "I wasn't involved at all. I knew about it. I had heard about it, and a lot of these little small-time operators thought they'd use my name. And when I found out that the game might be fixed, I didn't bet on it."
What a great citizen.
Yes, because I don't want to make money on something that might be tainted.
You mentioned something there about him teaching them how to dress, keeping things low key. That was sort of I don't know. I used to read about John Gotti. He eschewed all of that and dressed.
He was a little too flashy, yeah.
Yeah, which was something that the other boss is not a big fan of.
They did not like it at all.
Carlo Gambino, who had been it was his Castellano was his predecessor, and then before Castellano was Carlo Gambino. Those guys were like super low key.
So Paulie, Paulie Castellano is who Johnny Gotti whacked.
Yeah, outside the steakhouse.
And Carlo Gambino, but he hated Castellano. He had Castellano whacked. When Gotti took over, though, it was Gaspipe Corallo.
Oh, Anthony Gaspipe Casso?
Anthony Gaspipe Casso, rather. Yeah, Casso. And I'm getting mixed up with Sopranos, Corallo. And Anthony Gaspipe Casso. And we're in Greenwich Village. And the real pub of Greenwich Village was...
Vinny the Chin.
Chin.
Yeah.
Not the Chin. Just Chin.
Just Chin. He would point to his chin so that people wouldn't say his name.
No, actually, you know where that really came from? His last name is Vincent Chin... Gigante. But his first name was Vincenzo.
Oh, Vincenzo. So Chin.
And his mother used to call him Vincenzo. And all his friends started calling him Chin when he was a kid. So he was called the Oddfather. He used to wander around here in Greenwich Village.
Kind of muttering to himself.
Muttering incoherently
like a bathrobe, as if he was...
In a bathrobe and pajamas and slippers. exposing himself to traffic and urinating in the middle of intersections.
Oh, that's fantastic.
By which he kept law enforcement for nearly 20 years. He kept law enforcement convinced that he was mentally incapable of running an organized crime family.
Yeah, I think I was reading the Casso book, and they were talking about coming to meet with Gigante, and to do so, you'd enter a building, and then they would lead you through like a series of like below ground hallways and tunnels until you find. Yeah.
Right over here.
That's amazing.
I mean, around the corner from where we just met, in fact.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's one of the sort of the coolest things I've always loved about New York City is wherever you go, you're walking through history, because, I mean, this is really the oldest points in the United States, all the stuff that's gone down here. We're, right above Canal Street, right by Little Italy. Do you have kind of like a favorite spot in the city that you're like, this is where my,
I was going to say, I mentioned
happen?
that we have 3 tour products. I told you about the Rise and Fall of the American Mafia, which is strictly the mafia, and from the end of the 19th century. The Jewish Mafia is Jewish Gangs Tour down on the Lower East Side. And then we also have the other main product that we have. The Rise and Fall of the American Mafia is number 1. Number 2 is Little Italy Chinatown Tour.
Okay.
And that starts with the Gangs of New York, like Scorsese's Gangs of New York. So that starts the mid-19th century with the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys and all that.
That was the 5
But
points.
then we also get into the Chinese gangs. And Chinatown used to be honeycombed with tunnels under the buildings.
I just finished reading a T.J. English book. I don't know.
About the pickpocket?
The
pickpocket sale?
About the modern American mafia, Chinese mafia. It's the BTK, Born to Kill.
Mm-hmm.
They're the Vietnamese gangsters.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that all that. Like, I grew up in North Jersey. I was born in '85. My father's a journalist. He's been covering New York and New Jersey forever.
Nice.
So I had no idea that any of that was going on over in Canal Street. I remember when I used to, I interned for KTU, and the Clear Channel radio stations are right on Canal. I used to walk around in and out of the shops and stuff, like during my lunch break or whatever. I had no clue what would have gone on there like 15, 20 years prior. Like, blown away.
Right. I was living here in Manhattan at that time, and I was, I was in my 20s.
So that was
in the 80s when that was, it was pretty crazy. Yeah, I mean, these guys were shooting shit up down in Chinatown.
Like having full-out guns. They shot up a funeral in Linden, New Jersey. They showed up and blasted the entire thing. And I'm reading it, and it's like something out of Fast and the Furious. I'm like, there's no way this actually happened. Mm-hmm. And then I go and Google it, and it's all there. I'm like, what? How did I miss this?
And they were nationwide. I mean, the thing is that they weren't a tightly organized, triad or whatever. They were, but there were BTK chapters across the country.
Yeah.
And again, they didn't have like any kind of central organizational thing. But if you were BTK anywhere in the country, you could find refuge anywhere else in the country where there were people who called themselves BTK.
I was gonna say, it almost feels like kind of like a Bloods and Crips thing. Like you represent your set when you're local, and then if you go out and you kind of know the handshake.
And of course, BTK came from these guys were all Vietnamese refugee orphans. They were children when they came here, and so BTK came from something that U.S. soldiers would put on their helmets.
Yeah, Born to Kill.
Born to Kill. Yeah.
How about that? That's
so that was pretty crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely wild.
Well, interestingly, in that book too, I'm sure you read the book and you were enlightened of the fact that it's like before 9/11, the Immigration Naturalization Service, the enforcement of the enforcement arm of the Immigration Naturalization Service, was the least funded, the most neglected. They had almost no resources at all to work with.
Yeah, they were saying that about ATF as well. So there's a big joint thing, and it was going on right sort of in the shadow of the downfall of the Gambino family. I guess when they finally brought the RICO case that brought down Gotti and everybody, and they got Gravano to roll on them, and they were worried. They have the agents talking about how their big concern was, look, if they break this RICO case on the Gambinos before we get this case against the BTK guys going, we're not going to get any press coverage for it. It's going to be it's going to be useless for us. So they were rushing to get the indictment out and picking everybody up.
Gotcha.
And they were the book kind of circles around an informant that they had who went down. I guess they had done a robbery down in Georgia at a jewelry store.
Yeah,
They shot the
exactly.
guy in the head, and this kid's terrified. You know, he started robbing places because
Well,
he
what's
just needed
interesting
food.
is the fact that a lot of these kids that were part of BTK, the only reason they were part of BTK is because they were brought here as children. They were fostered in American families. They were all separated and didn't have anybody in their own culture. And they were completely like in a round peg in a square hole. And so most of them ran away when they were 15, 16 years old. They found their way to the cities where they found their own kind. And their own kind were being led by older refugee Vietnamese guys who were criminals.
Is that?
But it's not like they weren't brought up in a culture of criminality. They weren't natural born killers.
There's a survival instinct that takes over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I mean, I guess as with every immigrant experience in this country, that when you first get here before you assimilate, you're going to gravitate to where your people live because there's a comfort zone there, and it's survival.
And although, and I mean, one of those most common terms is like, as soon as somebody says, "I'm not a bigot," they're going to come out and say the most bigoted thing you've ever heard. Yeah, but the thing, the reality is that, I mean, Sicilians and Southern Italians, many of those immigrants, I mean, well, put it this way. Let me back it up a little bit. One of the things I can make a little disclaimer when I do my tours. There are between 15 and 20 million people in the United States who identify as predominantly Italian or Sicilian ethnicity. Over the last 100 years, perhaps 250,000 people of that demographic have been involved in organized crime, which means they've always really represented less than 1% of the population of Italian and Sicilian people in this country, but they get all the press. And the thing is, though, the people who did get into the criminal enterprises here were coming from a culture of that. They had that in their background.
The Black Hand over
and the mafia in Sicily and the 'Ndrangheta they were coming from that background already. It was like they were already steeped in those traditions.
The story then of the the poor Italian immigrant who gets involved to survive, was that a thing, or was it more along the lines of guys were coming over, they had done a little bit over there, and now they're going to keep doing it over here?
Yeah, more along those lines. Yeah, that most of people who were coming over. I mean, starting in the late 19th century with immigrants, all these Italian, Sicilian immigrants are coming over. And filtering in with them were a lot of guys who were actually fugitives from justice.
Okay.
In Italy and Sicily. And they continued. They carried on this. It was a family tradition. Now, to be fair, why did it happen in Sicily and southern Italy? These were very rural places, and people were just poor.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, I don't know, what people talk about here with the 1%, like the income gap is widening between working people and the wealthy. And that was actually even much, much more dramatic there. And young people had nothing to do. There was no work. There was no way to make money.
Idle hands.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. And so they started what the country people, especially in Sicily, considered they were basically like vigilantes. They were going out there and looking out for the interests of their own people and extorting money from the lemon growers and the orchards, stealing cargo on the shore, from the commercial waterfront, and ultimately they became like a vigilante army for the overlords, for the big landowners.
So is there an element of, look, you're going to kick us a couple dollars, but we're going to present, because this is rural Sicily we're talking about, and who knows what lurks, at night, who could be coming in. We're going to look out for you guys, but to kind of fund
Protection
that,
racket.
we're going to need a couple bucks.
The protection racket.
Okay.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. But it really became a tradition by the mid 19th century in southern Italy and Sicily.
And then following that, there's that huge wave of southern European immigration that comes over here,
yeah.
And they say,
and again, the vast majority of them were honest, hardworking people, just looking to make a better life for themselves and their families. But there's a little thread of criminals in the middle of all that, shipping over with them.
Okay, so the early 1900s in New York City, and we have this mass of Italian immigrants coming in, and the ones who are involved in crime are what would be considered a low level here in the States, and then a few years later, Prohibition kicks in.
Right.
And that sparks it.
Well, a lot of, what you mentioned before, a lot of the, specifically the Italian and Sicilian criminals started out with what they call the Black Hand, which was never an organization. It was really a technique or a strategy.
Yeah.
And it got so bad that almost anybody was using the Black Hand. There's one story of a young woman who was pissed off that her boyfriend, she was like 17, she was ticked off that her boyfriend hadn't proposed to him and sent him a Black Hand letter.
She penned by herself?
Yeah.
She forged it with her Black Hand.
She threatened him to propose to her. So it wasn't really an organization. It was a strategy. It was a method of extortion.
My girlfriend hasn't gotten that pushy yet.
That's a good thing. In any event, though, it started with the people who were called the first family in New York was the Terranova Morello gang. Giuseppe Morello came here in 1890, and he was joined by his brother-in-law was Ignacio Saeta, or Ignacio Lupo. That was his real name was Lupo. He was known as Lupo the Wolf.
Lupo the Wolf?
Lupo the Wolf.
That might be one of the best mafia names I've ever heard.
Well, it gets even better. Lupo means wolf in Italian, so he
Wolf
was
the
Wolf
Wolf.
the Wolf, right, or Wolf Squared.
Some big Duran fan.
So they started. They're called the first family. They weren't really. I mean, there were already many other criminal gangs operating in New York. But like I said, I mean, they were relatively low level. They were relatively local. They didn't extend nationwide. They did have contacts in other cities across the country, but they didn't have like an exchange. But then Prohibition came along, and that just raised the stakes for everybody across the board. And the old, what Lucky Luciano called the Mustache Pete's.
Yeah, the old school
They all
guys,
got sidelined. Yeah. They all got sidelined.
Is that like Joe the Boss Masseria, all those guys?
Joe the Boss Masseria. He was the first one to come along, and Joe the Boss Masseria, I mean, first of all, he was rude, crude, poorly educated, but a very, very effective gang leader. Are you Italian ethnicity?
I am. Yeah.
So you may have heard the term Gavone.
Yeah, of course.
Of course, Joe the Boss. Gavone is actually a corruption of a Sicilian word Gaffone, which means hog. So a Gavone is a pig.
Yeah, you eat like a Gavone. Yeah.
Yeah, you eat like a Gavone. You eat everything on the table, and
Wouldn't
you get
be
up.
Sunday dinner if I didn't hear someone say it. Yeah.
You get up wearing half of your meal on your shirt front, so you have a snack for later. That's a Gavone. Joe the Boss was a Gavone, but he was a very effective gang leader, and he was the first one in New York who basically called himself Il Capo de Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. Yeah, and started demanding tribute from other gangs in the city, other criminal enterprises in the city, and there were quite a few.
So that's when things sort of start to become organized.
Yeah,
crime.
well, yeah, they were
looking...
starting to become organized, absolutely, under him. And then Charlie Lucky Luciano joined his gang and set him up.
I was going to say, Luciano, when I read about him, when I see him portrayed in movies, really, and I don't know, how much of it is sort of artistic bullshit, but comes across as like a very, very savvy, streetwise,
he was smooth.
Cunning.
Yeah, he was very sharp, no question.
And then did he work with the U.S. government a little bit during World War II? Some sort of.
They say that, and there must have been something. Put it this way: there must have been something, because in 1946 he was released from prison. He had been sentenced in 1936 to 35 to 50 years imprisonment. So he was released just 10 years later, and that is because the story is that the United States government went to him to seek his cooperation in preventing sabotage on the waterfronts of both New York and L.A., to help safeguard the waterfronts in here in New York and in California against sabotage by German and Japanese agents, because they knew, basically, the mob controlled the waterfronts.
Yeah.
So afterwards, he was released in 1946. His sentence was commuted. Interestingly, his sentence was commuted by the same man who had sent him to prison, which was Tom Dewey. In 1936, Tom Dewey was a special prosecutor, federal prosecutor here in New York City. And in 1946, he was governor of New York State. So he signed the commutation papers to release Charlie Luciano, but he was also deported to his.
Now, was the deportation a punishment that was just tacked on by surprise later, or was that part of the deal? Look, we're going to let you out, but you got to get out of the country?
Oh,
Or?
I think it was a surprise to him. I mean, look, you watch the police procedural shows, they don't tell people what they're going to give them when they make a deal. They're like, listen, you help us out, we'll help
you out. They always
That's
make it
as
very
much-
vague.
Yeah, because they can't. They can't really make, substantial promises. But people understand, okay, they're going to help me get out early, whatever it is. So they didn't tell him they were going to deport him. I think it really was a surprise to him. Interestingly, when he came to this country as a child, he came through Ellis Island, Immigration Inspection Station, as Salvador Lucanilla. 41 years later, in 1946, he was deported through Ellis Island because by the 1940s, Ellis Island had been turned more to a deportation rather than an immigration station.
Oh, really? It's funny, and again, and this is probably just because I'm an Italian American, and our huge wave of immigration, I think, lasted for us up until like the 1920s at the latest.
30, 40 years. Yeah.
So I never even gave Ellis Island credence after that. It was still in use for a while, but
technically Ellis Island was part of the government and a government station until 1954. But they stopped using it for immigration purposes by the early 1930s. So it was just really a 40-year window from like 1892 to 1932 that over 12 million people passed through Ellis Island to enter the United States.
So you mentioned Luciano setting up, it was Joe the Boss that he set up?
Yeah, so he set up Joe the Boss in a deal with Salvador Maranzano, who was Salvador Maranzano was the boss of the Navy Street gang over in Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
Okay.
And he was one of the major gang leaders who did not buckle to Joe the Boss. He would not pay Joe the Boss tribute. Most of the other gangs in New York, they were like, yeah, all right, we'll cut him, we'll give him money. We'd rather do that than have trouble. And because they also weren't as big as Joe the Boss Masseria. Joe the Boss Masseria, I started saying, he was rude, crude, uneducated, but a very effective gang leader. It is believed that at his peak, he had well over 100 people on the street, 100 soldiers working under him in his gang. So, but Salvador Masseria over in Brooklyn, he wasn't going to give in, he wasn't going to buckle, and he made a secret deal with Charlie Lucky Luciano, who first became part of Joe the Boss Koch, his family, and became very, very close to Joe the Boss. He was really like his number one guy. And then set Joe the Boss up to have him whacked out in Coney Island.
I was going to say, so is that the Castello-Moresi War? Is that the battle between those two?
Yeah, because most of Salvador Maranzano was from Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, and all of his people were. They were all Castellamarese is what they called themselves, or what they were called. So they were all from Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily.
Okay, so where's the New York City Mafia after the kind of the dust settles on that one?
Well, Charlie Luciano set up Joe the Boss Masseria. Then he becomes head of his own family here in New York under Salvador Maranzano. But everybody knew, and nobody was more painfully aware than Salvador Maranzano, that Charlie Luciano had an axe to grind with him, too. First of all, Charlie was way more ambitious than being satisfied just being the head of his own family. Secondly, Charlie Luciano had taken a nasty, nasty beating a couple of years previously. A couple of thugs picked him up on the street, left him for dead in Coney Island. They thought they'd killed him, but they didn't.
Is that where he gets the nickname Lucky?
That's where he gets the nickname Lucky, allegedly. And everything, remember too, in the mafia tours and mob history, all that, everything's alleged.
Yeah.
Because real history is hard. Gangster history is secret. They weren't taking notes.
And it is, not beyond Italian Americans to be a tad braggadocious too. So you never know.
Too.
You never know when we're full of shit.
But so the thing is that Charlie Luciano first set up Joe the Boss, and then less than a year later he set up Salvador Maranzano and had him whacked. Now Salvador Maranzano had taken the title after Joe the Boss. Salvador Maranzano had taken the title of boss of all bosses. Charlie Luciano, again, like you mentioned, he was too smart for that. So rather than taking the title boss of all bosses, he established what was then called the commission. And he said everybody's got an equal vote. The commission was pretty much made up of family leaders from New York, Florida, New Orleans, and Buffalo.
Okay, what year are we sitting at?
1931.
Right? 1931.
Mhm.
Okay.
And also, Prohibition was over, or they knew it was coming to an
Yeah.
end. It was coming to a close, and they were a little sad about that. That was such a lucrative source, but they found many other ways to make money illegally.
Well-
Labor racketeering, and the other thing, one of the themes that I generally bring out in my tours is that there is a myth that the mafia doesn't deal in drugs. The mafia never did not deal in drugs.
Yeah.
The mafia has always dealt in drugs since the beginning.
That's the Godfather certainly helped propagate
yeah.
that myth with the whole keep it away from kids or
Yeah,
whatever the hell.
yeah.
Through the 80s is when the drug sentences started getting very big. Some of the bosses wanted a more hands-off approach because they were worried about RICO predicates
Exactly.
being used.
Well, no, way
guys,
before RICO in the 50s, the federal government started getting a lot heavier on
The
in
sentencing, yeah.
And the bosses said, like, if a guy's looking at 20 years for
then
slinging
the incentive to rat is that much bigger.
Exactly. And so that's when, allegedly, again, in 1957, there was a big meeting
Is that
of the
upstate
commission.
at the
This
Appalachian?
is after the Appalachian
Okay.
meeting, yeah. There was a big, Appalachian was a debacle. Appalachian was a friggin', see what happens, before Appalachian, this is in 1957, law enforcement, right up to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, they still did not accept that there was an organized crime network operating in concert across the country. They wouldn't accept it. J. Edgar Hoover used to say, they're a bunch of hoodlums. They couldn't organize like something like that.
Yeah.
Appalachian was a conference in upstate New York, a little town in upstate New York at the home of Joseph Barbera. And there were gangsters from all across the country, and they just basically, it was uncovered. And they could no longer deny that there was this concerted effort of organized crime across the country.
Yeah, so what's this? The local cops just start noticing all of these
It was a
vehicles
statey.
pulling up.
It was a statey named Edgar Crosswell, who had pulled over a gangster. I can't remember who he was now, but he'd pulled over one of these guys like a year before, who gave him the wrong ID. He gave him somebody else's license, and he was, driving a big black Cadillac. Crosswell couldn't hold him then, but he saw that guy particularly, and all these big black fancy ass cars driving up to Joseph Barbera's
So we
estate.
usually don't see those up here.
Not like that. And so he called local enforcement, and they all had out-of-state hold plates from different states. And so he called local law enforcement. The best part, though, is that these guys are just walking up the driveway writing down license plates numbers. They had nothing. They had nothing on these people at Joseph Barbera's estate to bust them on. But the gangsters looked out the windows. They saw the cops walking up the driveway. They're like, "Cheese it, the cops." They all started running. And they started running through the woods. The people of the neighboring town, the people of Appalachia, New York, said for months afterwards they were finding rolls of bills and guns in the woods.
I was going to say,
around Barbera's estate.
Given the way those guys were prone to dress, you see all the pictures. You imagine they're running through the woods in like zoot suits.
Yeah, they're all in
that's fantastic.
they're all in nice suits and nice shoes and and,
shiny wingtips slipping on rocks.
Crazy, yeah. They're all tearing their $500 suits.
That's
at the time.
fantastic.
And they took in, they pulled in 60 of these guys, which they had to like spread out over like a dozen different local precincts. They held 10 of them.
Yeah.
Because they had nothing on them. But it was like turning over a rock in the woods and seeing all the worms and the bugs under it. And it was like, okay, this really exists. Nobody could any longer deny that there was an organized crime network that worked across the country, And so that's when the federal government stepped it up. The federal government said, okay, we really got to and so it was right after that, there was a meeting here in Little Italy of the commission. The two things they decided was no more new guys are going to get made. They closed the books. Getting made, of course, is what happens. That's how you get to be a made man. After you serve maybe like 10 or 15 years as an associate in the mob, then you get made and you're really a part of a family. That was one decision. The other was made guys could no longer deal drugs. Made guys cannot deal in drugs under pain of death. It wasn't very long before that became just don't get caught.
Yeah.
Really.
Now that made guys can't deal drugs. if you're a made guy and you have a bunch of guys who aren't made working for you, can you skim from that with a, look, just don't tell me where it comes from, I'm kicking this up high?
That's pretty much the way it
Yeah.
works, in general. I mean, because the other thing is, too, a made guy is supposed to kick up to his boss, to the next guy up the ladder. What percentage of his earnings do you think he's supposed to kick up?
God, 20%? Are we talking?
20?
Higher?
No, 30% is what he gets to keep.
Oh, wow.
70% has to get kicked up the
Ooh,
ladder
ruthless.
to whatever his capo DCM, or from him up to the underboss. Yeah. And
That's
the funny
rough.
thing is, people would ask me too on the tours, they're like, well, it's all, this is all ill-gotten gain anyway. It's all criminal enterprise. How are they going to know? You don't want to test that theory.
Yeah.
It's like, even guys who are given the full 70%, every now and then the boss will call them in and say, hey, listen, so I
his
understand
envelope's a little
you
light."
got a racket going on down in Chinatown that you're not reporting to me. It's like, no, boss, really, everything I make, I go, I don't know. I don't think you're giving me your full cut. I'm going to keep my eye on you.
Yeah,
Even if they know you're giving the full cut.
in I think the phrase "good earner" comes up in
Yes.
like every mob flick book the show that
That's
you
what
read.
it's all about.
He's a good earner. Why should we promote him? He's a good earner. Why
Yeah.
shouldn't we clip this guy? He's a good earner.
The bottom line is, if you get to be a made guy in a mob, you did not just get some kind of a lucrative position.
Yeah.
You just got an obligation.
Yeah, a rather serious one too.
very
I mean,
serious one.
If you hear like the little speech, the little preamble they get when they sign up, it's more important than your family. If your if your wife's in the hospital giving birth and the kid's going to come out dead.
the secrets of our family to anyone outside our family, may your soul burn in hell the way this saint is burning in your hands.
Yeah, it's and the thing is that the reason though it's an obligation is what you do get is you get protection.
Yeah.
You cannot fuck with a made guy. You don't. Nobody. And you also got all these other guys. You're part of a network. And you talk with these other guys about, rackets, about schemes, scams. What can you cook up? What can you do together, Hey, there's a shipment coming into JFK next week of fur coats, and I know a guy who works in the on the ramp over there in JFK, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of the way it works.
And that's again, if you're a mob movie fan, you've seen a million of these scenes where they're all just sitting around the social club. It looks like they're doing absolutely nothing, and I think there's a great one from Donnie Brasco where I guess times are a little tight, money's not coming in, and Lefty is trying to bust open a parking meter. It's like right before they head down to Florida to hop on the boat with Santo Trafficante.
You know what? It's great, actually, that you mentioned Donnie Brasco, though. I'll tell you why. That is a guy I know whose dad was a made guy. And he talks about, he says, the thing is about Donnie Brasco probably is the most accurate depiction of the life of a made guy. Because think about it, in Donnie Brasco, Al Pacino, Lefty Guns Ruggiero, he's always scrambling. He's always hustling. He's always like, this, that, little things. He's like, hey, you remember that $200 I loaned you last week?
Yeah.
I could use that. That's the life of a made guy. They don't make a lot of money. They weren't kings at all. They were always hustling and scrambling and scraping.
Oh, especially if
For
you
a
have
couple of hundred here, a couple of hundred there.
Especially if you're a gambler and you start getting
that too,
getting in on that.
But even if you're not a gambler, it's not an easy racket to be a made guy, and you're at the beck and call of your capo.
Yeah.
So, like you said, that's the most, you don't get to really, it's not much different than the legit world, You're not really going anywhere until you're in management. So you get to be a capo DCM, and then you got like 5 or 6 or a dozen guys under you who are kicking up to you. And you could kind of kick back a little bit. Then you got a little cushion in life,
So the New York 5 families, the Lucchese's, the Genoveses, the Bonanos, the Gambinos, and the Colombos, how do they kind of break that? Like, where does that split happen? At what point do they say, you guys got this, you have that?
That actually started with Salvador Maranzano. So after Charlie had Joe the Boss Masseria waxed, Salvador Maranzano held a meeting where he had representatives from across the country, from all the major cities. According to Joe Valachi, you may have heard of the Valachi papers.
sure.
Joe Valachi was Joe Profaci's driver. And Joe Valachi, according to Joe Valachi in his book, he said there were over 100 bosses from across the country at at Maranzano's little meeting up in the Bronx. And so Maranzano established the families across the country. He didn't establish them. And again, these were pre-existing gangs, but they were the most powerful gangs in their regions or their districts.
Someone sort of incorporated them.
Exactly. I mean, so he basically sanctified them and said, you're all now a part of Cosa Nostra. Nobody ever, by the way, there is no such thing as the mafia. You understand that?
Yeah, LCN. La Cosa
Not
Nostra.
L. Forget the L either. That's a mistake.
They don't even do the log.
No, it's just Cosa Nostra because it means
CN.
our thing.
Yeah.
What would LCN would be our thing.
Yeah, I've heard it translated to
grammatically incorrect.
this thing of ours. I don't know if the,
that
the
too.
English.
But Maranzano established what he called Cosa Nostra, and most of Cosa Nostra, just like New York City. New York City has 5 boroughs, which are also 5 counties. Most cities across the country reside within a county. They're just one part of a larger county. New York City has 5 counties, are all a part of New York City. And in the same way, across the country, you had these families controlled like a region, controlled like a quarter or half of a state, or a region that incorporated a number of states. New York City needed 5 families. Charlie Luciano was put in charge of what had been Joe de Boss Massaria's family. Tommaso Mangiano headed another family, which had been another gang. Vincenzo Gagliano was yet another family. Joe Bonanno was around from the beginning, so he was the head of a family, and Joe Profaci. So those were the original 5 families: Luciano, Mangiano, Profaci, Bonanno, and Gagliano. So that's where that comes from, that organization. These were all different gangs operating in New York City previous to that time.
So is there, as the families kind of go along, as we get later and later into the 20th century, is there cooperation between them? Do they work in different rackets together? Do they have different stuff going? A
lot of cooperation, a lot of rivalry. That's the whole thing. I mean, that was the purpose of the commission, was to, when there were any disputes between families, there was the purpose of the commission was to resolve them. It never really worked very well, and there was always like hostile takeovers.
Yeah, well, I was going to say obviously, I mean, John Gotti is sort of, when you think about the New York City Mafia, he's kind of looked at like the prolific guy.
That's a hostile takeover.
Yeah, they just did that terrible Travolta movie. The HBO one with Armand Assante that they did a while back was amazing.
I don't see that one again. I haven't seen that one.
That one that thing is like a who's who of mob movie actors in it. It's like half the cast of The Sopranos is in there. It's a great flick, especially for just an HBO production. But I guess at issue, the bigger issue between Gotti and Castellano was that Gene Gotti and was it who was his other buddy?
John Gotti's brother.
Yeah, Gene Gotti and.
Yeah, the other guy.
He died of lung cancer or throat cancer. We're selling heroin, and Castellano was going to use Roy DeMeo to whack them out.
First of all, John Gotti and all the captains, all the guys on the street, hated Castellano from the beginning.
Yeah.
John Gotti's mentor was Neil Della Croce, who was Carlo Gambino's underboss. And Carlo Gambino, on his deathbed, named Paulie Castellano the new boss instead of Neil Della Croce, because Paulie Castellano was his brother-in-law. Gotti and a lot of the guys on the street were resentful of that from the very beginning. And I mean, think about it. Gotti, his mentor was Neil Della Croce. If Neil Della Croce had been made the new boss of the Gambino crime family,
his star's on the rise.
He might have been underboss right then and there. But so there was bad blood between them from the beginning. Also, a lot of captains, a lot of guys on the street, a lot of the working mafiosis, they called Paulie Castellano a paper don. He never whacked anybody.
Yeah.
And he was a snob. He only ever socialized with celebrities and politicians. He made his captains go to Staten Island to pay him tribute in his mansion. Rather than having a social club,
yeah, I think the
somewhere more
Ravenite
convenient.
was Gotti's, the big hangout.
They had to go to Staten Island to his mansion. He perversely called the White House. So there was a lot of bad blood there, Gene Gotti, and I can't remember. I can't remember his partner who you're talking about. They started slinging drugs.
Angelo Ruggiero.
Angelo,
Yeah.
I knew it was a Ruggiero. Yeah, Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, John Gotti's brother, started. They got indicted for slinging drugs, which would have been Paulie Castellano's rationale
Yeah.
for getting rid of him.
And he would have had a perfect, no problem.
He had an
do
excuse.
It, yeah.
There were transcripts made. There were tapes made of Gene Gotti on the phone, transcripts of those. Johnny Gotti and Neil Della Croce kept stalling because Paulie Castellano wanted copies of those transcripts.
Yeah.
And they kept holding back. And finally, Paulie Castellano thought he was so smart. A maid, a housekeeper in his White House in Staten Island, allowed a cable TV repairman in to look at the cable TV issue, who wired the place, and then they made tapes. The FBI made tapes of Paulie Castellano. So now he was under indictment. So he was somewhat defanged as a result of that.
Yeah.
But
So does that slow it down enough
it slowed it down. It was a simmering pot between all three of them. The other thing is, Johnny Gotti had asked Paulie Castellano if he could whack. He asked Neil Della Croce, his mentor. He said, I want to whack this son of a bitch, Paulie Castellano. I'm going to get rid of him, and then we'll make you boss. Neil Della Croce was old school. He said, no, he's the boss now. You got to respect him. Don't ever say anything like that to me again. And so then Neil Della Croce died. Neil Della Croce died in 1985, and Paulie Castellano did not show up at his funeral, which was John Gotti's rationale for whacking Paulie Castellano.
Is there a reason that Castellano doesn't show up at the funeral? Is it
because he's under indictment?
Okay, so he doesn't want to be seen.
He couldn't. The funeral was going to be like just chock full of known felons.
Yeah.
If he had showed up at the funeral in the company of all these known felons, he would have been arrested immediately.
Really? So even under...
And everybody knew that.
Even under indictment... I mean, you've already been indicted. You can't go to a funeral. There's no...
No, you can't.
Really?
No, you can't. You can't have contacts and possible
is that
setting up plans.
Is that considered associating with known felons?
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exactly what it would have been. Yeah. And so Paulie Castellano couldn't go to the funeral. Gotti knew this, but this was a good enough rationale for him.
Sure, but it gives... All you need is a reason.
Tell all his people, he said, this son of a bitch doesn't go to the funeral to the guy who should have been his boss. That's it. He's out.
So, I mean, there's still obviously, I think, anyone who's involved in organized crime at the time sees that and says, well, he's under indictment. Obviously, he can't. This is, sure, there's a reason to do it, but it's still kind of thin. Does that create sort of a crisis of legitimacy for Gotti going forward as the head of the Gambino family?
Yeah. Well, again, too, because, anything like that, we're taking out a boss. Just to take out another made guy, you're supposed to go to the commission.
Yeah.
Gotti didn't do that. That's why Gaspar Picasso and Chin Gigante.
Yeah,
that's why they wanted to have him. They wanted to have him whacked, and they tried to. In fact, they blew up
the
car,
right?
Yeah.
When they wound up killing was his underboss or his driver?
His driver, yeah. They whacked his driver, blowing up a car, and they did that too because that was not a thing generally that the American mob did. The American mafia generally didn't go with bombs, car bombs, and things like that. That was more of a Sicilian thing.
Yeah. They
thought that would throw off law enforcement, throw off other mobsters, thinking that they weren't involved with that. So yeah, they did not like Johnny Gotti at all.
And where does that attempted hit go down? Is that over in Brooklyn? Is that here? Did Gotti have?
I think it was in Lower Manhattan.
Did he have a little? Was his club on Mulberry Street?
Right on Mulberry Street.
Okay.
Which again, that was another thing too. That was another thing that kind of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. In that, by 1985, mob bosses were not using social clubs in Mulberry Street.
Yeah.
Because Little Italy was too many tourists, there was too much surveillance, and everybody
very
knew.
Visible.
Gotti and everybody knew that, first of all, the club itself was wired, and they had cameras on rooftops watching it day and night, constantly. It was constant surveillance.
Yeah, I love that the FBI always has lots of pictures of guys walking down the street.
Yes. But the thing is that they had video and movie cameras watching these guys. So in order to talk, first of all, they knew the club was wired. Even though later one of the technicians who was involved in that, FBI technician, he said, we couldn't understand anything they were saying. There was a jukebox going. We didn't have the sound isolating technologies you guys have now. So the wire inside the club, the bug in the club was useless to them, but the boys didn't know it.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't talk inside the club. They would go outside. They knew that FBI had guys, cameramen on the rooftop, and they would get lip readers to figure out what they were saying.
So would they just stand there with their hands over their mouths?
They would walk up and down the street with their hands over their
great.
mouths.
There's almost a brilliance in the simplicity there.
No, that's true.
Like I was actually
That is true.
After college, I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, and our joke is always that with the least funded portion of the Department of Defense, we have to
Is that
steal
right?
leftover stuff from the Army. So like that kind of just very basic
Right.
yeah, we'll
Jerry
just use this.
improvise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll use a stick. That'll do. Like, kind of, it just speaks to me. I'm like, yeah, I get that. That makes perfect sense. And if I feel like if you explain that to someone in corporate America, they would be like, no. We have to have synergy and a big plan and a bunch of stupid keywords.
You have to have
and-
forms in triplicate
yeah,
for everything.
Like, no. We just walk around with our
You have
hands
to
in
have
front of our mouths.
requisition. Yeah, that's what they did.
That's awesome.
And then but then that wasn't working for Gotti, so they started using the apartment of an old mob widow
yeah,
in the building.
Mikey
above the
Sorelli.
Ravenite. Mrs. Sorello.
Yeah.
Mrs. Sorello. And they started going up and using her apartment. And it didn't take the FBI too long to figure out when they would see Mrs. Sorello leave the apartment every evening at 6:30. Gotti and the boys enter the building. 2 hours would go by. Gotti and his boys would leave. Mrs. Sorello would return. And then they realized
That's
that
not
they were using the place.
not too tough for a federal
Yeah.
agent to put two and two together.
But what was tough is that not only now, where the Ravenite, where the Ravenite was, is now a neighborhood that we now call Nolita.
yes,
It's not really a part of Little Italy
north
anymore.
of Little Italy.
North of Little Italy. It, of course, could just as easily stand for no low-income tenants allowed,
Yeah,
which is true. But back in those days, it was still part of Little Italy. You had Gotti's men were hanging out. They were standing out across the street watching the building at all times. And not only that, you also had the original Homeland Security, which was all the old Italian grandmas hanging out the windows watching all the time.
absolutely.
Watching what was happening.
I still have a few on my my street in the
and
Heights.
they thought Johnny Gotti was a hero. They loved him. So what the FBI had to do is they actually got an agent who went over rooftops from down the block, rappelled down the back side of the building, the courtyard behind the building, down to Mrs. Sorello's apartment, got in, wired the place, got back out the same way, all undetected by
That is
neighbors.
so cool.
And they started making tapes. It is. It's pretty
That
crazy.
that is so cool.
It's amazing.
So you mentioned that the neighborhood kind of looks out for him, and you hear like, oh, he would throw a huge 4th of July party and fireworks and barbecue.
Exactly.
But is there a cognitive dissonance because when you read about the way that a lot of these hits went down, I know like you have the more stealth ones where they just pop some guy in the back of the head and then drive off. But I was reading about Tommy Karate Patera. Who, the absolute psychopath, had essentially his own graveyard out on Staten Island in, is it Great Kills Park out there?
I don't know that one.
An absolute
Yeah.
lunatic. They're talking about how he would have his guys pick up guys that he wanted to whack, bring them to his social club, hang them upside down, flay them, and do. There's got to be like
Torture 'em.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you have to know if you're hanging out in the neighborhood that these gentlemen are doing quite well for themselves, but they're not going to a 9 to 5. So that obviously there's something missing there.
I think put it this way: for the majority of people are like, the majority of people's philosophy is go along to get along.
Yeah.
You know what? They're in charge. They're brutal. They are insane. Just look the other way.
Don't step on their toes.
Let me tell you, I have a friend who grew up here. Well, his dad grew up here in Greenwich Village. He lives here now in this neighborhood. His dad and his uncle grew up here in the village. They grew up with Chin Gigante. They knew him. They were childhood friends with Chin Gigante. Now, he went his way. They went an entirely different way. My friend's uncle was a leader of a youth group. He like a Boy Scout club or
Sure.
something in the neighborhood, a boys club. And the kids were like, they were young adolescents. They were like 13 or 14 years old. Chin Gigante and his guys were recruiting among my friend's uncle's boys club. And he went to him. He just went right to him. He said, hey, Vincent, what are you doing? You can't do this. And Gigante was like, yeah, I'm sorry, Bobby. You're right. I'm sorry. I'll leave him alone. I'll stop. And they did. And another episode, my friend's dad and his uncle, they all moved up to like Westchester, but they would come back down to the city, to like do things. They were all eating dinner at Dante's down here on McDougal Street. They were in Dante's. They were all having dinner. And Chin walked into the place. He's like, oh, Bobby, Jimmy, how you doing? So nice to see you. And he just chats with them. And they were actually nervous. They were like, okay, Chin, nice to see you, too. As he's walking out, he nods to the manager of the place, and he does this symbol. He taps his arm, his forearm. He looks at him. He taps his forearm, which means on the arm, which means they don't pay.
I was going to say the tab got covered, huh?
No, the tab didn't get covered. He's just saying they don't pay. He had no ownership stake in the place, and he was not planning to pay for that bill.
Yeah, I was saying the tab got covered. It's just not by anybody.
They don't pay, period, yeah. And my buddies, my friend's dad and his uncle, as they were leaving, they said to the manager, hey, we know Chin said it's on the arm, but, we want to take care of it. The guy's like, please, don't reach in your pocket. Please. He said, well, let's take care of the waiter. He's like, no, please, nothing. Do not take anything out of your pocket.
I'll tip him myself.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Have a good night, but don't. Because look, people are watching through the window.
Yeah.
And these guys both, basically, these two men said, it's like, Chin Gigante and all the people around him, from childhood, these people were psychotic.
Yeah.
They were completely friggin' nuts.
And well, the appearances are so important. If any money changes, it immediately undermines.
Yeah, well, exactly. His authority. Yeah, it's like, oh, what's the matter? You don't listen to me?
So the Gambino family unravels in the early 90s when they get Gravano to roll.
Testify, yeah. But then Johnny Gotti's son, John Jr., took over.
A little bit
for a
inept
while.
from what...
Nobody was very impressed by him.
And it doesn't seem like the family after John does not seem to be the most arch criminal minds, because I think the grandson just got busted selling pills out in Queens.
Yeah.
And
of course, Sammy Bull Gravano. I mean, look at him. He went into witness protection, him and his family.
And then gets caught selling ecstasy.
They relocated to Taos, New Mexico. And not only his son was the one who started doing it. The best is Sammy's rationale, why he joined his son. He said, I didn't want the kid to get in trouble, so I figured I better show him how to do it right. So his whole family got popped. They were running the largest ecstasy dealing ring in the history of New Mexico.
Jeez. Well, hopefully they were sampling the product. They at least get arrested with a smile on their faces.
Yeah. But Sammy just got out last year, too.
Yeah, and I'd read an interesting article where he would actually go and, as an informant, like after the fact, he'd tell the cops, like, oh, no, this guy that you're charging, no, he didn't do that, or that. Let him go, and then like tell him to get a different guy. He's like, I already rolled. I may as well make sure the guys aren't getting busted for crimes they didn't commit.
Or he's just looking out for his friends.
That's also a distinct possibility.
If they will accept that.
So. That, I guess, to the at least like kind of the layman who's following organized crime, is kind of looked at as like really the big blow that signals the downfall of the Italian American mafia. Over from the early '90s through, I guess, present day, what path does the Italian mob take in New York and New Jersey?
Well, actually, I mean, like what we were saying earlier about how it was the Italian Sicilian mafiosis who inducted their own sons and passed it on down the family, whereas the Jewish mob didn't do that.
They wanted their kids to get out.
They wanted their kids to get out and go to college. Since the 90s, that's the direction the Italian mob has taken as well. They send the kids to school, and they also got wise. They said, you know what? You go down to Wall Street, you got a license to steal.
Yeah.
It's friggin' swag, stolen without a gun. And that's where a lot of them have gone. A lot of them have gone into the financial industry.
Yeah, there's certainly the trope of the thick-neck pinstripe
and they're
suited.
scheming and scamming there too. They started in the '90s. They started running what we call boiler rooms.
Yes.
Which is like basically they'd open up a securities firm and start touting a couple of fucking companies that didn't exist. They'd have some address in Hackensack.
I was
for a company in an empty office.
I was going to say, it's funny you mentioned that because I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Boiler Room.
Yes.
But there's a great line
Yes,
from
I
that
have.
where one of the guys from J.P. Morgan runs into the Boiler Room guys and says, "You guys dress like you're on Gotti's crew."
Yeah.
Which is a great little underhanded jab.
That's true, though. I mean, because there's a lot of them were coming from that background, too.
So I guess before we wrap up, 2018, are you like on top of what's going on in OC and everything today, or
I'm not. I'm not really delving too deeply. I mean, one of the things, like I say to people, it's like our tours basically end with John Gotti.
Okay.
Because we could tell you things a little bit more current, but then we got to look over our shoulders, and because really, I got a buddy of mine who has another tour company, who used to work with us, and he's very involved in Little Italy.
Yeah.
And he says, you don't understand. He says, a lot of these guys are coming out now, too. A lot of the old timers.
They're getting, after doing 20,
they're
20,
coming
30,
out.
yeah.
And they're coming back. And they're back on the street. And so, really, it's like, there are times we have canceled one of our tours, the Little Italy Chinatown tour. We start on the very bottom end of Mulberry Street, and we go right up through Little Italy. We won't do it during the San Gennaro Feast.
Well, you can't walk, yeah.
That's not even the issue, though. The issue is that you got all these Guidos and wannabes from the suburbs who are standing around, and they hear us, and they're like, "Hey, yeah, you're talking about my Uncle Vinny that way.
Yeah,
Come on,
I love that.
hey,
I absolutely love
and
that.
they all start getting wise with it. It's like, okay, there's too much hassle.
That's too funny.
I've also had legit, like, of the very few, there are like maybe 150 Italian people left in the neighborhood that we still call Little Italy, which is it's really a Disney World.
I mean, it's
Little
getting
Italy.
crunched by Chinatown.
It's about 3.5 blocks on Mulberry Street
and Soho's
with 2 dozen quaint Italian restaurants where all the waiters and maitre d's are Albanian, all of them.
Great.
But there's still a few genuine Italian people left there. I was doing a tour walking up Mulberry Street one day, and this lady's running a Toroni stand on the corner of Mulberry and Grand. She starts yelling at me. She's like, "Why are you telling them the negative stuff? Why are you only telling them the bad stuff? Why don't you tell them the good stuff?" I'm like, "Because it's a gangster tour, and that's what they paid
for.
The
bad stuff's a lot more interesting.
They want to hear the bad stuff. They don't want. We could tell them about Enrico Caruso, but that's not what they signed up for." But it is. I mean, it's still there. They're still there. There's a couple of journalists. One whose name I can think of is Mike Lupica. Heard him? I think he had an article a year or so ago. He had an article. He writes for the Post.
Yeah, the Post and the Daily News still cover organized crime.
And he had an article which was, he said, "If you think they're gone," and he described going down to Little Italy. You go into one of these restaurants at lunchtime, and you see a bunch of big, beefy guys with thick necks sitting around, laughing a little too loud and being a little demanding. Oh yeah, they're with us.
Yeah,
they're still around.
That's funny. Yeah, my dad tells a story about I forget if it was Carnelia on trial or if he was sitting next to Carnelia in the bleachers and getting like squeezed and hugged when the verdict is getting read because this big mobster is so nervous about seeing his friend maybe doing 30 that he needs someone to hug. I guess. Just last thing before we wrap, do you have a favorite story, personality from all of?
I mean, there's so many. I like. Well, one of my favorites. I feel bad for him because I was like an underdog. Was Bugsy Siegel.
Okay.
Bugsy Siegel was sent by the gangs back in the early '40s. He was sent out to L.A. to bring Frank. What's his name? Frank Dragna and his gang under control. Bring them to heel. Remind them that they're part of the Cosa Nostra and they need to follow orders. And he met a young starlet named Virginia Hill, who had been the girlfriend of every mobster that came through town, one after another. But Bugsy fell in love with her. She took him on a road trip out to a dusty little town in Nevada called Las Vegas. And Bugsy had a vision, and probably now Bugsy wasn't the sharpest tack in the drawer, but he saw this little Las Vegas where gambling is legal, and it occurred to him because until that time, the mob they were running all their gambling operations in Cuba.
Yeah.
And he's like, we could bring it here into the continental United States. People don't have to go to Cuba. We'll do it right here in Las Vegas. And he started building the Flamingo. He borrowed $1 million from Meyer Lansky and the rest of his mob buddies. What was it? I think 2 years went by, and he wasn't done yet. He tried to have a soft opening in 1946, at Christmas 46. And he was going to have the big opening on Christmas Day. Not a good idea. Not a good plan. Yeah, nobody really had any interest in going. And he was going to have celebrities and stars. He was also a terrible, terrible money manager. Allegedly, he brought the same set of trees 10 times over for the property. So he made his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, the construction manager. And that debt that started at $1 million within 2 years had climbed to $6 million.
Jesus.
It was $6 million by the end of 1946. It turns out Virginia Hill had squirreled away about half of that in Swiss bank accounts. And they had to whack Muggsy. They finally whacked Muggsy.
One thing that'll lead men astray.
Yes, indeed. Addicted to the pink.
Yeah.
But it was the thing is that this is also coincides with Charlie Luciano had been it was 48. I'm sorry, it was 48. Charlie Luciano had been deported to Sicily. He tried to make a comeback in Cuba, and he was going to set up shop in Cuba. He came back for a meeting of the commission in Cuba. And it was in that meeting where, Meyer Lansky and Charlie Luciano were Bugsy Siegel's besties in life. But they couldn't save him. They couldn't save Bugsy because he owed the mob $6 million, and it didn't look like he was going to be paying it back anytime soon.
It's above all else a business.
Absolutely. It's just business, pal.
I think beyond, that's a great take-home message because people see, they hear the lounge music and the nightclubs and this and that, but it all comes down to cash.
I'll tell you, a couple of asides, a couple of things that we cover in the tours too is that, of course, during Prohibition, gangsters ran all the speakeasies. A lot of people don't realize that right up until the late 60s, early 70s, gangsters owned all the gay bars in New York.
Yes,
because gay bars were illegal.
I was going to say that
until the late 60s.
There wasn't a huge problem. I guess there was mafia protection for Stonewall until the federal government got involved.
No, it was the city. It was the city law enforcement who decided to raid the club.
Did they decide to raid it, or were the feds didn't drive them to crack that? Because
they didn't have. They weren't even I don't even think there still are any federal statutes against homosexuality.
Okay. Well, I would.
It was a local thing.
Anymore. But, Thaddeus Russell has a book, A Renegade History of the United States. Mm-hmm. Super interesting, and there's a chapter on all things sex, prostitution, and obviously gay bars take a huge chunk. And I had before that I had no idea that the mob was linked.
Well, there was also over in the East Village, 82 East 4th Street, was a club called Club 82.
Okay. Which
I remember from the 80s. It was an after hours and a rock club in the 80s. But previous to that, from the 50s, it was a drag bar. It was a big drag bar. It was owned by Vito Genovese. He made his wife the manager of the place, and then he had one of his capos watching her because he believed that she was having an affair with other women, having affairs with other women.
Okay, you know what? I shit you not. I think that is in Thaddeus Russell's book.
Oh, that could very well be. But here's the other thing, is that almost all the rock and roll clubs in New York City paid a mob tax.
How about
they were
that?
Either owned by gangsters or they had to pay a mob tax. They had to pay tribute to mobsters. One of the very few that didn't was CBGB's.
Okay.
Because CBGB's was a Hells Angels hangout. And the mob went by there thinking, we got to get tribute. And they saw the Hells Angels like, we'll just leave that one.
Yeah.
Let that one alone.
Yeah.
And the Angels didn't want anything but free beer. So Hilly Crystal never paid mob tribute.
A little bit easier to come up with,
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, look, I appreciate you doing this. This is super cool.
Great chat with you, man.
I know the first half of the audio sound like it came out all right, so hopefully
we'll see how this,
hopefully we good on this.
Well, that's it, folks. The podcast is over, but you could find more at nycgangstertours.com and citywalksnyc.com, and check out my pages, facebook.com/The Savage Crew, at Mike Montone on Twitter, at Gary_Moiler on Instagram, and for any listeners who are interested in checking out Matty's tours, let him know that you heard about him through the podcast. He did mention that, so be sure to check him out, and I will catch you guys next time.